Welcome. I'm Peter Gordon with my colleague Dan Ziblatt here in the back. I'm pleased to welcome you back to another lecture in the lecture series on questions of fascism and democracy. The complete schedule is listed up there, and we've had wonderful speakers of this term, and I'll just alert you to the fact that there are two more speakers in the series, April 8th and April 15th. I should say not just two more speakers, two more events. Next Tuesday, Stephen Hansen and Jeffrey Kopstein will be here to speak about the assault on the state. And then the week after, April 15th, Intent to Destroy Russia's 200-year Quest to Dominate Ukraine with Eugene Finkel. Sobering topics for a sobering time. But I'd like to turn to today's speaker and offer some words of introduction. I want to say on a personal note that today's speaker has been an enormous inspiration to me and to my own struggles to understand 20th century German political and legal thought. I know of nobody who's more qualified to guide us through the difficult work of 20th century political theory than our speaker today, Bill Scheuermann. Bill Scheuermann has written about that topic and a great many others. He is currently James H. Rudy Professor of Political Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. He's the author of numerous books, and I won't list all of them here, but let me mention one that's had a great influence on me, Between the Norm and the Exception, the Frankfurt School and the Rule of Law from 1997. More recent books include The End of Law, Carl Schmitt in the 21st Century, and Civil Disobedience from Polity Press in 2018. And I should mention The Norm and the Exception won not just one award, but two prestigious awards. He's also the author of Liberal Democracy and the Social Acceleration of Time, published a bit earlier in 2004. A monograph on Hans Morgenthau, Realism and Beyond, 2009, and much more recently, bringing us up to the themes of today's talk, the Cambridge Companion to Civil Disobedience, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. Professor Scheuermann is currently has currently finished a book which should be forthcoming by the end of the year, Property Disobedience as Protest, Rethinking Nonviolence. Today, Professor Scheuermann will speak to us on resisting authoritarian populism. Please join me in welcoming Bill Scheuermann.
So there we go. Thank you very, very much for that gracious introduction. Let me thank Susan Sprague for getting me here. Let me thank you all for coming. And let me just say very briefly, I was a grad student in the late 80s, early 90s at Harvard, and this was a place on campus where those of us who didn't always fit into these neat disciplinary boundaries that we have could feel very much at home. So I'm very grateful to be here because back in those days, I got intellectual support, I got professional support from the center, and I also got some material support. I got a fellowship that allowed me to work on the dissertation, which became one of the books that Peter mentioned. Now, the talk I'm giving today is a little bit different from most academic talks I give, and the reason for this, I don't think you're going to have a hard time understanding or appreciating. Like many of you, I am struggling, and that is the word, I am struggling, to figure out how to resist creeping authoritarianism, right, within what I'll call just loosely today, more or less democratic states. So what approach or what approaches are best in terms of pushing back against what scholars are calling democratic backsliding, democratic regression, democratic erosion. As you can see, my slides are a bit like the old days of overhead projectors. Hopefully you can read them. I'm not very modern, but you know, I suspect some of you can, well, hopefully you can read them, right? So just to get the ball rolling, so what have scholars been telling us the last 10, 15 years? Well, in a nutshell, they're telling us things look a little bit different from how they looked even in the relatively recent past. We're not seeing the sudden collapse of democracies, typically. We're not seeing military coups. We're seeing a process of typically gradual erosion Backsliding, the key players are civilian leaders, and typically they are not necessarily aspiring for some sort of old-fashioned authoritarian state or fascism, okay? That's at least what we have seen so far. These movements, these leaders may or may not be populist. Despite the title of my talk, I'm not going to say very much about that, but I'll be happy to do so if you'd like. Now, if you can see all the words, there's a lot of words on the slide, I realize, but if you can see at the end, I have an asterisk, and I just want to explain that asterisk. So basically what I'm giving you here is a characterization of what the scholars have been telling us has been going on, empirical people working. Just one quick point. I think we have to leave open the possibility that this is still an open process. We don't know where we might be 5, 10 years from now. This might look very different. And I think that does speak to the issue of fascism, whether or not that's a possibility. So far, that hasn't happened, but maybe we can talk about that. All right, so here's what I want to do. I want to go through and talk about what I think the main approaches that at least I think are the most important ones so far to resisting backsliding. All right, and I have 4 of them. Why have I chosen these? Number one, for each one of them, there is a substantial and oftentimes impressive scholarly literature, right? So I'm really interested in what the scholars have to say about these things. A lot of different types of scholars we'll talk about in just a moment, including a number who are here, fortunately for us. Number 2, these scholarly approaches, even if you haven't followed, I don't know where everybody comes from, but if you're not an academic, you will hear echoes of these things if you're following the political debate. So I think they have some relationship clearly to things that people are talking about politically. I will treat them for the purposes of the conversation as relatively distinct competing models, but you will hear me in just a moment say we can combine them. In fact, they probably have to be combined. I hope I can impress on you there is a logic to my presentation, and I'm not just adding these things or kind of talking about them individually. What's the logic look like, or what do I hope it's going to look like? Well, I think there's a progression here. So as you begin to understand the political limitations of each one of these approaches, as you begin to grapple with possible analytic, conceptual limitations, you have to consider the next one. So there's a kind of progression, which doesn't necessarily mean that we end up, you'll see. I mean, what I have to say about uncivil disobedience is complicated. All right. I also think the logic to my presentation may have something to do with real life politics. We'll talk about this, but my sense is we probably have to hope that the most moderate approaches work, but we have to recognize that they may not. So that's also part of the story. A couple of caveats, and then we can get into things. I'm a political theorist. I'm not James Carville, right? You've noticed that. I don't think I want to be James Carville. Maybe I should, although some of the things he said recently I wasn't so impressed by. But all right, I'm not James Carville. And so this is different. I can't give you the strategy that we need to have. But I will say this, and this has struck me as I've been thinking about this, the kind of boundaries that I think a lot of us who are scholars like to see between our roles as scholars, in my case, political theorists, and all sorts of very complicated contextual judgments and evaluations we want to make about politics, this gets a lot messier than I think many of us may be comfortable with. And I think this is certainly true. I interact and argue with lots of philosophers, and they do a lot of excellent, but oftentimes relatively abstract work on political obligation. I think there are some limits to that. The bad news, I've already warned you, I don't have answers. I'm sorry. But here's the good news. I hope by the end of this conversation, we all together may have a clearer sense of what the issues are and what we might want to do. Okay? So there you go. You all know who this is. This is, Representative Cheney looking, I think it's from the January 6 hearings, and not surprisingly looking very concerned. I suspect she's looking even more concerned if we could zoom her in here somehow. And I think it'll be obvious in a moment why I shared her image with you. So let me talk about this first approach. I'm calling this elite pushback. And again, I'm trying to describe a lot of different stuff going on in terms mostly of empirical political science, comparative politics. So this is an approach that basically says, what you want to do, and you are most lucky if this works out, is you want to rely essentially on, I'd say, elite level decisions, elite level political culture, guardrails. This is the language that Levitsky and Ziblatt use in their important 2018 book, Elite Level Strategies, all right? Now, if you dig into this, I think there are two different, they're closely related, and perhaps it's silly to try to see a distinction here, but I think there are actually two different versions of it, okay? One version basically says before backsliding even starts, we want to hope, right, that elites are doing the right thing. When they do the right thing in pushing back, you're going to be in pretty good shape. The other version is basically amounts to saying when backsliding has started to happen, right? When you're going down the road of backsliding, guess what? You still have to, or there's still reasons for believing this is a smart way to go if the elites do the right thing. There's a great interview, Levitsky and Ziblatt in The New Republic. If you haven't read it, you should go and read it. You might get even more depressed than I suspect you are, but it's really good. It's very prescient. And I think Levitsky sort of, captures the core of this approach, right? I know in the United States we have this idealized vision of citizens defending democracy. Like it or not, my view is that democracies are defended by elites, all right? And there's also a great book, and thus the quote here, and I'll say a little bit more about this book. Laura Gambio, who I think is at Notre Dame and I think is an assistant professor, I mean, she has gone and looked at basically, I think it's Venezuela and Colombia and then some other cases. And it's a really powerful book in terms of showing after erosion has started to happen, what are the different things elites do and, what works and what doesn't work. All right, so let me just make some general claims about this literature, and hopefully they're accurate. I mean, I think underlying it is a kind of democratic realism. Don't know if people are familiar with that term. If not, we can talk about that, a kind of elite theory of democracy. As I said, it's been influential, and I think increasingly influential as far as I can tell, especially within comparative politics and poli-sci, and for good reasons. I mean, these people have marshaled an impressive body of empirical research suggesting, if you are lucky, this is the way to go. Maybe not just if you're lucky, but, elites need to think about this, all right? And hopefully they can learn something, which I think, and that's, it was interesting, the debates, I forget if it was the presidential debates, but I think the word guardrail at some point appeared. This has now become part of elite discourse, which may have something to do with the Levitsky and Ziblatt book. Now, there are all sorts of debates, I would say, or different inflections within this genre. I don't have time to get into this. So one question would be, which elites count? Are we talking about Representative Cheney coming together with Vice President Harris? Are we talking about judicial elites, right, as a bulwark against autocracy? What about social elites, leaders of civil society organizations? Which norms, which guardrails? And last but not least, and maybe for us most important, which elite strategies, right? Moderate versus more radical ones, and so on. Regardless of these differences, I would say there's a broad consensus in this genre, elite-centered pushback is the way to go. Very briefly, a lot to be said, I think I've said this already, in favor of this approach. In contrast to the more normative approaches I'll talk about in a moment, again, these people have done their empirical homework, and that should count for something. So why not, just leave things there? Why not end things and you can all go home? And I guess we count on the elites to do things. Well, number one, this may not work. They don't always do the right thing. And I think right now it's a very serious, well, it's an open question, right? Whether or not what we're seeing in this country looks, useful or constructive in this ways. And number two, I do think, even ignoring that political point, there are some unanswered questions within this genre. All right, so here they are, very briefly. Another empirical scholar I haven't mentioned, a guy named Andreas Schedler. I think he made this point very clearly and nicely in a piece. It's a little out of date, but he's right. A lot of his recent research, to use the kind of social science jargon, is kind of small n. We really don't have that many cases, perhaps, so we need to be cautious about assuming that it's generalizable. Number two, this is something that struck me reading the Gambio book, and I think it does speak to our present situation. An implicit premise, and you saw this when I gave you the definition of backsliding that people are relying on, is that this is going to happen in a relatively gradual way, okay? But what if that's not the case, all right? What if the process moves very, very rapidly? So in other words, if we have time in this country to litigate, that takes a lot of time, right? If we have time, for the midterm elections and political elites to mobilize, maybe we can minimize the dangers. But what if, and this is maybe what we're seeing, the temporality here is more like that of a coup. So here I think is potentially an internal problem with this genre. Last point, and this will lead me to suggest why we have to go beyond elite pushback. You know, what's the role of mass politics, including popular protests? Mass politics is lots of things, obviously, right? Well, we know empirically, right, these protests happen when there's democratic backsliding. And indeed, you know, this literature acknowledges this. So if you go and you look at the Levitsky-Ziblatt book, again, the 2018 book, you know, they say, I think quite smartly, we need, this is 2018, to resist Trump, a broad democratic coalition. And that also means, you know, bringing together leaders of civil society groups. There's also a reference there, very brief, to the necessity of some sort of protest. And what the authors say is they should be defensive. They should be pro-democracy, not disruptive. So there's an acknowledgement, you know, that obviously more than elites count. So just a quick observation, you know, this elite pushback approach, interestingly, it's not just about elites, actually. All right, even though it looks that way, it's about civil society. It's about mass politics. I mean, I think it's really an argument about getting the right nexus or connection between different types of elites and, let's say, mass politics and protest. You know, my point: this means we have to consider, for imminent reasons, right, these alternative, or well, yes, we have to think about protest politics, not just elites. You also get this in Gambio, and I want to say a little bit about this because I think this is where you see something similar going on, but also maybe some of the limitations of this approach. I mean, she clearly thinks that mass politics, including protest politics, is part of the story, and it's been part of the successful story sometimes. So her preference, and she thinks the evidence shows this, is for what she calls moderate institutionalism, which basically means you use ordinary political and legal mechanisms to mitigate backsliding. So I think in the US that would mean, right, we litigate, we mobilize for the next election, the kind of thing that happened to Wisconsin. That is the most successful approach, she thinks, the evidence shows. She also, however, leaves room for what she calls moderate extra-institutionalism. Now, when I read this, I thought, aha, you know, here's where you start talking about messy protest politics. Turns out that's only partly true, because she really has, I think, a very narrow view of protest politics. I mean, she sees the ones that have been, in some cases, successful to some extent. They are strictly legal and strictly nonviolent. I'm not satisfied with that, and I don't think you should be either, for a lot of reasons. But most obvious one is, I think, well, think about what happened under Trump 1. Okay, so yes, there was elite pushback. There's no question elite pushback was crucial to keeping the sorts of things that are now happening from happening last time, it seems to me, right? But there was also mass political mobilization. There are many protests, nonviolent protests, legal protests, and also some very messy protests that many people viewed, we'll talk about this in a moment, as violent. There was civil disobedience, which by definition is illegal. So one should hesitate before talking about Trump, the case of Trump 1 and protests against Trump 1 as a success story, given where we are. But I suspect many of us in 2020 thought, okay, this had kind of worked, right? So anyhow, what's the takeaway? Despite the power, the empirical, case that's made, which is very convincing, the elite pushback theory approach, I just think isn't going to be enough. It isn't enough on its own terms, it seems. It includes some other things, all right? So let's talk about that. So here we are, civil disobedience, okay? And we're hearing again, calls for civil disobedience. So if you listen to the political debate, if you listen to scholars, activists, all sorts of people, they say, look, civil disobedience, it's not the only thing we need to do, but perhaps it should be central. I mean, I'm hearing this at least. Maybe I'm just listening or reading the wrong people to what we do. Why? Again, lots of reasons. And I'll just try to summarize what I think the most important reasons are. Number one, civil disobedience has a kind of normative status that other protest forms that involve illegality don't. If you can go in the United States, now you may do something which is unpopular, but if you can go and convince a judge or a jury what you've done is civil disobedience and not vandalism or terrorism, that counts. It counts legally, it counts rhetorically, it counts politically. I've also heard people say, look, civil disobedience, it brought down the Southland, segregation. Why can't it bring down Donald Trump? There's a success story, allegedly, okay? And number three, and I think this is the most important systematic reason, as democracy is imperiled, that's what backsliding is, as our political rights come under attack, guess what? We may have to use extra institutional means, my state just passed an atrocious law taking away, I'll spare you the details, but making it more difficult for students to vote, and that this is the tendency. And at some point, your options are so limited in terms of political participation. Yes, this has to be something you have to think about. Civil disobedience is a complicated concept. It's a contested concept in Galli's famous sense. A lot of different political versions of it. Just want to bring this to your attention because I'm going to focus on one today, right? But I know there are different versions. If you look at all these different versions, I think they rely on a shared language, okay? If you listen to radical Democrats or people like Gandhi, they all talk about civility, conscientiousness, nonviolence, publicity, and I think most interestingly, you break the law as a way of showing, as Dr. King put it eloquently, the highest respect for law. There are a lot of different ways that has been interpreted. I'm going to focus on the standard liberal Rawlsian view, envisioned by a fellow who taught over here, a while ago, into the 90s, John Rawls, right? So here, I won't read this to you, but you can look. Here is his definition of civil disobedience, and you will recognize many of the terms that I had up on the previous slide, right? So it's public, nonviolent, conscientious, et cetera, et cetera. Fidelity to law is crucial to it. So a couple things about this. Number one, and I think this is interesting and perhaps pertinent to our situation, he wants to say civil disobedience, we should view it as a protective mechanism. All right, it's something you use to ward off violations of basic civil and political rights, okay? Typically when majorities are violating those rights. That's kind of what he has in mind if you read this famous discussion in Theory of Justice. Civil disobedience is not a revolutionary strategy. He distinguishes civil disobedience from revolutionary approaches. It implies a general respect for the existing liberal democratic political order, and I'll explain that in a moment. Sorry, a lot on this slide, sorry. Okay, so, here's, I think, the crucial point, and this can help you maybe see why I think this is a view of civil disobedience that is relevant in some surprising ways, right? So he says civil disobedience, it's, in his language, it's designed for the special case of a nearly just society. This he says at the very beginning of this chapter, right? We're talking now about political illegality in the context of a basically liberal democratic order. And the argument, just to unpack it rather brusquely and crudely, is there is basically a kind of elective affinity between civil disobedience and liberal democracy. So civil disobedience is not just one tactic that you choose. If you're living in an almost liberal democratic society, an imperfect but still identifiably liberal democratic society, you break the law. This is how you should do it. And the reason for this is if you understand civil disobedience properly, you can see how its core attributes mesh with the fundamentals of liberal democracy, right? So you break the law publicly because you're trying to communicate, you're trying to reach your political peers. You do this as you show fidelity to law because we're respectful of the rule of law, okay? There's a special connection, in his view, between civil disobedience and liberal democracy. This is very different from, if you read someone like Gandhi, or even Dr. King, I think. All right, so why focus on this view besides the fact that Rawls was an important figure on this campus? Well, a trivial reason, it's very influential, has been. More important, I think, for us. I think it's close in spirit to what the social scientists who are advancing elite pushback are calling for, right? They say this has to be defensive, protective of democracy, okay? So, given the fact that I think they have a lot to teach us and maybe we should take that seriously, let's start here. And last point, and maybe the most important one, the emphasis in it on protecting threatened rights, okay? In the face of elective governments that violate those rights. I mean, that seems pretty pertinent to me, to democratic backsliding, even though I'm sure John Rawls never heard the term democratic backslide. But, in a way, this is surprisingly interesting. So again, you might say, here we go. We have this second approach, civil disobedience. We have a moderate liberal vision of it. So this is the direction people should go in. And there are some people saying things like this. Why not? Or what might the problems be? Well, here you go. Here's the other side of that elective affinity between liberal democracy and civil disobedience. And Rawls is very blunt about this. He says when you're not in a liberal democratic society, or you're not in a society that's close to being one, violent, legally evasive lawbreaking, okay, potentially revolutionary in character, may be legitimate. It may not make sense morally. It may not make sense pragmatically. The results politically might be dumb. But there are no principled political reasons, right, why you need to be committed to this. I mean, that's the argument. Okay, to put two and two together, how does this speak to us? Well, I think it does in an interesting way. I mean, on his terms, this is a very strict notion of civil disobedience, even on those terms. When democratic erosion is substantial, when we've reached a stage where I don't think we are now, fortunately, even old John Rawls, rest his soul, would suggest the legitimacy of militant illegal protests. Now, you might say, and I think you should say, that's not where we're at today. I mean, that's a political judgment of mine. Maybe you disagree. I don't think, we're living in an autocracy. I think that's absurd. So what about a less dramatic scenario? And I think there's some interesting ways in which he speaks to this as well. So there's a very dense passage, and here it is at the end of the chapter. He says, the wisdom of civil disobedience becomes highly problematic when common, in his language, principles of justice are in question. So when I'll just simplify this again, liberal democratic shared norms are no longer widely shared. The kind of ideals, right, that motivate political actors are fragmented. In those situations, he says, you know what, civil disobedience may not just be counterproductive, but you will see repression. Now, I'm simplifying, but the idea in his model is the way civil disobedience works is you appeal to your fellow citizens on the basis of some common liberal principles of justice, right? So, if your free speech rights are being taken away, you say, we're all committed, Constitution, to free speech. Now, when that shared basis dissipates, you're going to have a problem. Rawls was onto this. Well, this, I think, does, in a situation where some people think these folks doing that stuff in January 6th are national heroes, and some of us think they are fascists, I mean, we're moving in the direction, perhaps, of this kind of fragmentation. So, again, what's the key point? When you have this intense backsliding, which means, in part, declining fidelity to basic liberal democratic principles, or I'd put it differently, we have people who understand them in such radically different ways. That's what I'm hearing, Guess what? Yes, I mean, this Rawlsian worry becomes very, very pertinent. And I don't think he'd be surprised. This is where I think he doesn't think civil disobedience is a cure-all, Places like Hong Kong, where the protesters, the pro-democracy movement initially was pretty strictly nonviolent, I don't think he'd be surprised by the kind of clampdown that happened there. And I don't think he would, I think he would say there are reasons, even in our context today, to worry about civil disobedience, So I don't want to repeat the point. I have too many of these slides. I apologize. I'm teaching a lot of undergraduates who don't do any reading, I've noticed. I'm like, I gotta stick it up there, and then they maybe will pay. I usually have lots of quotes from the text, so it's like, here you go. You don't have your book, but there's Rousseau. Read it, damn it. So I realize it's too much. So okay. So one thing Rawls says is a general theory. It's true. This is actually unfortunately true. A general political theory of civil disobedience only takes us so far. And this is a general point, and and this speaks to something very important. Even he recognizes these very contextualized, complicated judgments we're going to make about where we're at, right? I mean, how much of a shared liberal democratic consensus exists. These are difficult questions, and they will have to be part of any discussion of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is not going to be a magic wand. Under some conditions, it's potentially counterproductive. And here's, you knew that already, right? But the point here is it's not counterproductive just for strategic reasons per se. There are normative reasons why it might be counterproductive. All right, so where does this leave us? Well, I think it means we have to move beyond civil disobedience and think about, a broader perspective on protest politics, okay? Not that civil disobedience is worthless, but it doesn't do enough. So here's the logic that I hope you can see. Now, civil resistance, this term, when I encountered it, I was confused by it because it gets thrown around in lots of different ways. So let me just clarify. So there's now, again, a very substantial, very imposing literature, mostly people who are working empirically, including someone here, Erica Chenoweth, I'll talk about in a moment, have been talking about civil resistance. This is really the preferred category for nonviolent movements that rely on a wide array of nonviolent acts, illegal, legal, all sorts of things, including civil disobedience, but a lot more. The inspiration, I think, for the genre is a fellow by the name of Gene Sharp, who I don't know if you've come across. He has 3 massive volumes where he goes through and talks about all these different nonviolent strategies. It's the thing activists often have. He apparently wrote it here in the late 60s at what used to be called the Center for International Affairs. I don't know what it's called now. He was on, which is sort of interesting because it's not the kind of thing one would associate with that center, but yes, he did this. And, people are basically updating what he did, giving it a kind of social scientific muscle, and suggesting, again, there's a lot of evidence that this can be very effective versus authoritarianism, right? So this is a literature that's less normative, it's more empirically attuned, and again, what you heard me already say, what I like about it is it's broader than civil disobedience, and that's probably what we have to think about. So just very quickly, here's what's going on with some of the social science. So this is Chenoweth and her co-author, Maria Stephan. This is a book, Why Civil Resistance Works. It won all kinds of awards, and I think justifiably. Again, maybe this is unsympathetic. I don't mean it to be, but it's basically sharp with a lot of good social science. So large N, a lot of coding of violent versus nonviolent protests. And the argument, and the evidence for it's very powerful. So these nonviolent civil resistance movements, they are successful because they mobilize large numbers, and they mobilize large numbers because the barriers to participation are lower than with violent movements, right? People are ready to go out in the streets, more ready to do that than become a guerrilla fighter. You're a guerrilla fighter, you're gonna have a hard time taking your kids to school, right? So this is a way to get people out on the streets. These movements are more resilient, they're tactically more creative, and they also generate loyalty shifts within among political elites. You bring people over from the security apparatus because they don't want to fire, at their cousins who are unarmed, who are on the streets. So this is what they show. So again, lots of strengths, very impressive in terms of the social science research. I'll just tell you this. If we had more time, we'd dig into it. I think I've already implied this. It's consistent with elite pushback. I just listened to a podcast that Chenoweth did in Norway, and she basically says this. She's like, of course, we do what I'm calling elite pushback, and then we do this as well, And as I also already said, this includes civil disobedience. So, we could stick John Rawls under this rubric. Not a normative theory, but as someone who's a normative political theorist, I think there's a normative argument, not only in terms of, a general sort of moral commitment to nonviolence, but if you think about democracy, right? Democracy has something to do with political respect, political equality. If you take that ideal seriously, it probably means we shouldn't be committing violence with each other, right? You don't do that if you view someone as a political peer. And I think that's kind of the implicit normative story here, that democracy, democratization, and nonviolence. Yes, there are moral paradoxes to politics, but that's fundamental. So what are the limits of this approach? This seems to be the way to go. And as I said a few minutes ago, if you think of Trump 1, maybe this is what we did in the United States. We did elite pushback, right? The deep state, quote unquote, did its job. The lawyers did their job. The judges, to some extent, did their job. Many times did the job. And, so maybe this is the way to go. So here's the bad news. And Chenoweth concedes this, and other people in this genre. The last decade or so, this approach is not working. And that's important because a lot of the argument is about efficacy. It's about, empirically, this is the way things are working. Here's a lot of cases showing this. And again, very complicated thing. One could do an entire talk on this. But what people have noticed is what is now, I think, being called smart repression, okay? So you're seeing autocrats and wannabe autocrats, and this is certainly true with the President of the United States. They've learned, and they're adapting. And they're doing some interesting things. So one thing you're seeing is less of a reliance on blunt force, because that often produces a mass popular backlash, okay? So you have, non-lethal weapons when you use force, all kinds of new surveillance technologies, right? Denial of state funding, that I added that to the list here, to universities. I don't know what I'm referring to, right? But I read something in the newspaper about this, right? I mean, these sorts of things. So there's a kind of, some of the literature talks about this as being very new. As someone who worked on the Frankfurt School, I want to say not really, but it is true, that the actual ways in which, for example, surveillance is happening. We're seeing new ways in which there's insidious manipulation, social media, okay? And this stuff, the autocrats are doing pretty well with this. So here's one reason why this is a problem. Second thing, and I think this may also speak to our situation, unfortunately. Yes, it's easier to mobilize large numbers of people, and that seems to matter in terms of the success of movements when the movement's nonviolent. That makes sense. But it is extraordinarily time-consuming, hard work. I don't know. I have to admit, I'm a political theorist. I hadn't been to a political meeting in a while. I recently went to one. I remembered why I stopped going to them because, right, you listen for people droning on, for a long, and you're like, when is, right? It's hard. I don't mean that to be, I'm a small D Democrat, right? But you have to have patience and perseverance, and it's time-consuming. It's exhausting. Now, in my view, this is always a problem in societies like our own, where the temporality of many social processes is accelerated. It's the term a German friend of mine, Hartmut Rosa, has come up with. There's always a tension, at least contemporary times, between modern times, I would say. Democracy, which requires slow-moving deliberation, patience, and a lot of other things going on in social life. But I think this general problem is aggravated, by the kind of situation we now face, right? If you have to push back against backsliding, not just during Trump 1, but Trump 2, as you all know, you don't need me to tell you this, people are tired. I'm hearing this from students, especially students who spent 2 years looking at screens during COVID, So, there's some real, I think, issues here in terms of, things to think about. Last thing, and I think this is the most important in terms of why I want to talk about a final approach. So if you dig into the debate about nonviolent civil resistance, okay, again, I'm crudely summarizing, but hopefully not inaccurately. So initially this genre, at least my reading of it, the reading a lot of other people had, it's a kind of defense of a kind of strict nonviolence. That's how I think it was intended. A lot of people come along, they look at the same data sets, and they say, no, actually, that's not what the data shows. What you're actually seeing is movements that are predominantly nonviolent. They're successful. But these predominantly nonviolent movements include a lot of messy things. Riots, property damage, self-defense, all right? And Chenoweth, to her credit, she just wrote a piece in the Annual Review of Political Science where I think she does a very nice job saying, okay, here's some evidence, has acknowledged this, okay? So, the point is this story is now different from how it looked, I think, 10 years ago. The story now is empirically more accurate. So this is really a defense of primarily nonviolent movements. Now, again, you might say, okay, still, we'll leave the story there. Why care? Why does it matter? Well, here's why it matters. I think, again, this genre, this answer to the question, what is to be done, it raises questions that it doesn't really have an answer to. It doesn't explore, in my view, sufficiently exactly what types of strictly nonviolent, non-strictly nonviolent protests are justifiable. It's not a normative literature, so that's not surprising. Which ones seem consistent with efficacious movements and so on. And this is what Peter mentioned this, but I have a book coming out on property disobedience where I talk about politically motivated property violations. And I think it's very complicated. They're typically just globally described as violent. A lot of social science does that, pundits do that, and I think that's just wrong. You have to dig into it. So these are the sorts of questions I think this genre raises and never really answers. So by the end of the day, even if you're sympathetic to this approach, and I think I am, again, there are unanswered questions. We're left with this messy can of worms. And the messy can of worms takes us, you'll be happy to hear, to the final approach. I've been talking for a while, and this is uncivil disobedience. So this is Minneapolis, 2000, the Black Lives Matter protests. I taught at the University of Minnesota for 5 years, and didn't live too far away from this. And yeah, I mean, it was pretty substantial. I mean, this was not just propaganda. I mean, there was devastation. I mean, my daughter went to Macalester College and after this, and we would drive around in these neighborhoods that I knew very well. I mean, there were, a lot of damage done. So the riots had a negative impact in many ways, right? So uncivil disobedience, what's this? Well, the most important theoretician sitting here is Candace Delmas from Northeastern, right? And this is Candace's definition, and I think I have it right. Tell me if I don't. It's protests that are politically principled, but they're also, so it's not just people doing stupid stuff, right? So there has to be some political character to this, and perhaps in relatively demanding ways. They're deliberately offensive, covert, anonymous, more than minimally destructive, legally evasive. If you go and you look at what a lot of philosophers are doing, and there's a bit of a generational gap, I think. Well, maybe we should. Candace, I know you're a lot younger than I am, so the old guys like me are more into the civil disobedience stuff, and there, I think, are people a little younger who are talking about uncivil disobedience, right? And, there's now a whole genre of people who are coming up with normative defenses. There's now normative defenses of riots and so on, all right? Now, this, we don't have time to get into all the nuances. No one is saying anything goes, right? Even that definition I gave you a moment ago, you see there are going to be some things that don't fall under the rubric of uncivil disobedience. So even though Delmas is not committed to nonviolence per se, she does say, these acts need to show some respect for basic interests in life and bodily integrity. She distinguishes uncivil disobedience from criminal disobedience, revolution, terrorism. However, this approach clearly leaves more leeway for many protests that most people would describe as violent, okay? And, protests that indeed sometimes are violent, even in a strict sense of the term. That is, there's, violence versus persons. I think the most controversial, maybe most interesting claim is that uncivil disobedience is potentially legitimate and also indeed obligatory, for reasons I'm not going to get into, even in basically liberal states. Now, there are a lot of very sophisticated arguments that Candace and others have come up with. I think when you look at these arguments, there's a lot of things going on, but I think there are two different general things. So my sense is a lot of this literature rests on, I don't know if you've encountered this term, it's a kind of philosophical anarchism. These are not political anarchists. We have anarchists in philosophy departments, and they're not out there in the streets, but what they do is they challenge the idea of any principled obligation to law, right? That there's something special about law, or even law within the democratic state, which means that it's deserving of, fidelity. So very, very different from Rawls. The other thing, which is closer to Rawls, it seems to me, is they often say these liberal states are, not just incomplete, they're profoundly unjust, okay? And that's close to Rawls in spirit, because the idea seems to be we're living in this kind of messy place already, autocracy and liberalism and all kinds of things. Even though this genre doesn't always speak directly to backsliding, in my view, I'm sure some future intellectual historian will look back and say, obviously, this is why people were talking about this when creeping authoritarianism was taking place. So the strengths of this, right? Empirically, it forces us to acknowledge the very messy realities, and they are messy, and I think they're messier perhaps than the nonviolent civil resistance people want to concede, which increasingly transcend these other approaches. And this is how I ended up working on property disobedience. It's really, and there's a lot of it going on. Like I've been reading reports from the insurance industry, and things have changed. Number two, normatively, it forces us to think about the justifiability of these very controversial acts, which the other approaches, I would say, they kind of sideline this question. And, clearly, when democratic erosion is advanced, when we unfortunately, let's hope this doesn't happen, let's make sure it doesn't happen, we're becoming more and more autocratic, this is something people will have to talk about. And I think if John Rawls had come back here, he'd say, okay, I disagree with these people, but I agree with that. Again, there might be prudential reasons, moral reasons. There are good moral reasons not to engage in violence, right? But there are, the kind of fundamental political reasons that you might have no longer work. Limits to this approach. So here's where Candace, I hope you give me a hard time in a moment. So I do think, Candace's book is wonderful, but I don't think there's enough in the genre as a whole systematic attention to the social science literature. So one thing I'm doing in this talk, I don't think there's been enough of a conversation between the philosophers, political theorists, and the empirical people. I just don't. And so in a way, I'm trying to do that, right? So a lot of the evidence the philosophers have, and this is what philosophers do, frankly, Candace does more, but I think some people don't do much more. It's kind of anecdotal, you know? So I think there's a real tendency to downplay possible counterproductive consequences. A lot of political science research, you know, on like the riots of the 60s, suggesting, however well-meaning, these things can be, you know, they don't go where you want to go, all right? Second point, this is a more conceptual point. If you look at this definition of uncivil disobedience, my reading of it is it kind of turns Rawls on his head. And if you dig into this literature, it's not surprising because old John Rawls is kind of a target. His view, in part justifiably, I think, maybe in other ways not justifiably, is seen as overly restrictive. So uncivil disobedience, I think, is a kind of residual category. It's everything that's not strict civil disobedience, all right? So why worry about that? Well, here's why. So it ends up including, a vast range of different things. So this argument has inspired me to go and think about this part of the puzzle. But one of the things I want to say is, you know, we need to disaggregate clearly. We really need to treat them. These are very different things, you know, and there's a long tradition of thinking about them that way. Now, in fairness, the literature on civil disobedience, it does acknowledge these differences. But I think by creating this kind of conceptual framework, there's a risk of maybe not kind of doing the hard work of thinking about these very, very different things, you know? So what I would advocate for is a much more differentiated analysis of these things, okay? And one that is going to ask some tough questions also about, you know, so which tactic, which approach, in which context? So I want to stick to the old, yes, it's Rawls, but it's a lot of other people. I believe that the kind of protests that are legitimate, are justifiable, that has to have something to do with the kind of regime you have, right? So if you're living in Orban's Hungary, you should get to do some things that maybe people in Sweden should not do. If you're living in Nazi Germany, you clearly should get to do some things that people should not do maybe and should not do in democratic states. So, this would be a plaidoyer for a much more kind of nuanced account, building on this theory, but I think also going beyond it in some ways. I also think there's some possible dangers when uncivil disobedience is viewed as encompassing a wide range of protests. When you're talking about the situation we're in, where democratic erosion is still relatively modest, you know, the clear political danger, and I think a lot of the social science evidence supports this, is these protests are likely to be viewed as a kind of retaliatory tit-for-tat. And, you know, you may end up ratcheting down democratic rights. There's some complicated questions here. And let me just, you may not like this, but I'm going to say this, okay? There's one example I have in mind. So I spent a lot of time, I'll spare you the reasons why, reading statements by the January 6 participants, and they're pretty shocking. But here's one thing they said which bothered me, and I think it's food for thought, right? They say, a lot of them say this, you know, some of them, the more reasonable ones said, I know I did something kind of stupid, got out of control. But you know who was far worse? Those people on the streets of America in the summer of 2020 who torched buildings and, right? You know, so this is where you can see a kind of, what I mean by a ratcheting down, you know, in unintended ways. And I just think it's naive not to think about that, obviously. You also see this, you know, so the other side of the elective affinity, let's say, between civil disobedience and liberal democracy is, you know, you could also say, well, there's an elective affinity in a disturbing way, potentially between uncivil disobedience and autocracy, right? So, you know, Trump is maybe the most uncivil political leader in American history. I don't think that's, you think I'm exaggerating? I think that's unfair? Tell me, convince me otherwise. You know, we've had some bad ones, but he's up there, right? You know, these guys evade the consequences of lawbreaking whenever they can get away with it. They tolerate violence against their enemies. They celebrate the violence of the January 6 participants. They like secrecy. There's no publicity, So there's something we have to worry about here, And it's obvious why we have to worry about it. Uncivil disobedience potentially might reproduce rather than transcend uncivil authoritarianism. So, where does that leave us? Well, does this mean there's no room for these sorts of militant protests? I don't think that's right. And I do think as backsliding, if it proceeds, there will have to be even more serious questions about some of these tactics, right? But we have to, this is now a political, we have to be reasonably sure that they will salvage and rebuild democracy and not further undermine it. And they have to be things where participants have to be able to make some persuasive case to their peers, right? So, that's something to think about. Okay, you'll be happy to hear I'm finishing. So I have very, very modest concluding remarks. So here's what I've tried to do. I've tried to fill you in on these what I think the different approaches are. There probably are some others, but I think these are the main ones. I hope you now have a sense of these different things. Any general lessons? Well, I think one thing that I was implying but never really said, and I think most of the people I've been talking about would probably agree with this. Obviously, it's best to start with more moderate strategies, right? So yes, we want elite pushback. Yes, we want judges and litigation, and we want ordinary politics, but we may need to go beyond that, right? And so there might have to be a ratcheting up in terms of tactics, clearly. So I don't know how many of you are here because you're activists, but one thing I picked up on talking with activists is this term diversity of tactics, right? It's become a kind of cliche, and it comes from anarchism, I think. And I say to that, yes and no. If it means everybody just does what they want to do, and it seems to mean that sometimes, that's crazy. Oh, I'll do sabotage, you do civil disobedience. Hey, no, this is, right? No, if it means thinking about, having some kind of logic here, that's a different thing, right? Said this already, let me say it again. A lot of what I had to say ends up ultimately revolving around these contextual political evaluations and judgments, about where we're at or where we're going, about certain tactics, what we know about the history of those tactics, what the social science tells us. So I'm sorry, but I don't think there's a general theory that I can come up with as a political theorist. I wish I could, And, to state the obvious, the real work is going to lie in the hands of democracy's friends, elites, and ordinary citizens. And I think we also have to kind of hope that we have enough, there are enough democratic resources, put it that way, enough of a democratic political culture that things might work. That's complicated. Last thing. So like many of you, I've been paying attention to this fellow, the co-president, Elon Musk, right? So I've been, it's pretty shocking. And I've been reading, about oligarchy, because people are talking about this. It's a great book, Jeff Winters, who's a social scientist at Northwestern. He thinks the U.S. is a civil oligarchy. And I'll just put this out here. I think all of these approaches, there are references to economic issues, how backsliding responds to or comes out of. So a lot of times what's said is to push back against democratic disaffection, we need a kind of left liberal economic agenda, social democratic one. But there's not really systematic attention to these sorts of questions. It just strikes me that oligarchy, if that's the right category, if we're talking about a political system which is liberal democratic, but where concentrated wealth is just, has this, is allowing people to make decisions in ways they weren't able to, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, that also complicates the story, right? What civil disobedience, how does civil disobedience operate in, let's say, a liberal society that's increasingly oligarchical versus, let's say, one that's less oligarchical? Anyhow, big question. I don't have the answer to that, but I'm just putting it out there. We have to think about it. So thank you. I appreciate your patience. I apologize for my PowerPoints. They're really bad. And I'm sorry, at some point I'm going to get better by the time I retire. But yes, thank you very much. So.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. I don't think your PowerPoint was bad at all.
Well,
I think we
you're a
could
text
say
guy, though. You're into reading.
I might say it was artisanal, which is hip these days, so.
They're very homemade, yeah, organic.
So I'm just here to field questions, and so if you could just signal to me when you'd like to ask a question, I'll put your name on the list. I'm sure there are many. Please.
So, this could be very rapid. I don't just mean in the.
Oh, sorry, could I ask
Paul,
you-
yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah. Paul Tucker, Kennedy School. So
Yeah.
this could be very rapid in shifting from one state to another. So if you think about a government that desires to be authoritarian,
Right.
but is taking ginger steps towards it, which may or may not be true here, but it plainly could be true, then an excuse to declare a state of emergency,
Yeah.
cancel elections, is quite handy.
Right.
And how does a need for tactical adeptness fit into the categorization? So the categorization, say I buy it completely, and I think actually it's quite familiar in some respects in terms of European history, including in Western Europe during our
Yeah.
biological lifetimes. But it's not obvious to me how useful the categorization is in judging how to calibrate the extent of the resistance,
Yeah.
unless you're prepared to go way beyond your fourth category.
Yeah, so let me see if I get this right. The categorization I relied on, you don't think is useful, these four different
Well, no,
types?
I think it is. I think
Okay,
it is
sorry, I
useful,
just
but
missed,
think
I thought I
it's-
misunderstood
But I
that.
think the transition from one
Ah.
category to another
Right, okay.
could be
Yes,
slow or fast.
yeah,
And I think there are some categories that are missing,
yeah. So-
that go way beyond. the
Yeah,
four-
so why don't you say what
the
those
four
are?
categories.
Yeah.
Well, they amount to armed resistance.
Right.
And so, as a European, I think, oh, what's interesting about America is essentially there are militias on both sides.
Yeah.
I don't quite know how large they are or where they are.
Right, Yeah.
But if something like that were to be, a rough approximation
Yeah.
of the truth, the transition matrix would be much more rapid than
Yeah.
if I'm completely wrong
yeah,
in saying that. So it would be kind of, if one embarks on, we want to keep liberalism,
right,
and oh my God, we've provoked them into declaring a state of emergency, and now we're slipping into civil war, then ex post one might say, oh, maybe they weren't the best tactics after
Yeah.
all. I have nothing intelligent to say next.
right.
Okay,
Yeah, no,
question mark.
now I understand you, and I thought you were saying that, and it's funny, I was debating, and that was my fifth, and one issue is I don't want to talk for another 20 minutes, but, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, if in fact the process looks very different from how it maybe looks elsewhere, right? And we really are in some, it's not 20th century autocracy or fascism, but it's looking. I mean, China is a novel form of autocracy. It's also not mid-20th century autocracy, right? I think there has to be a serious conversation about those sorts of things, armed insurrection, I didn't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it only because I don't think we're there. And I guess I have, maybe you heard that.
My challenge is in terms of accidentally ending.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's, I think it's a possibility, and I think it's scary, obviously, right? So why am I hesitant to put that out there? Because I just think it's premature. I do think, with Rawls, who was an old-fashioned liberal, when you're living in an autocratic state, yes, I mean, those types of approaches, including revolutionary violence, are appropriate. So part of my answer would be yes. The other part of me is more the social sciencey person who says we know, and this is where Chenoweth's work, I think, is very powerful. We know that those movements tend not to work out very well, right? So, but there would have to be a conversation about that. I mean, it would really have to be, it seems to me, a tragic last resort, obviously, and then a conversation about that. I mean, in terms of state of emergency, I mean, they're all you put something out there. I'm sure you're aware of this. I mean, I didn't even know this. I didn't even know the tariff stuff is happening under the rubric of. I mean, I spent some time writing about 9/11, and I learned all kinds of nasty, ugly things about emergency laws in the U.S. And I kind of put that stuff aside. But
Very easy.
yeah, Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, so I think it would depend on, what kind of emergency laws, right? I mean, they take a lot of different forms, obviously. But yeah, as when you're in a regime where increasingly the president thinks he can just rule by executive decree, and people go along with it, or, when the courts push back, he may ignore them. I mean, that's a very different ballgame, clearly. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have, I mean, it's a fundamental question, yeah.
Bill, I kind of want to ask about, I think it's just a political strategy question, but it's maybe the question I keep running up against. The defense of democracy is like rhetorically boring. It doesn't mobilize mass numbers. And as you move through your numbers, elite pushback is, you don't really need, you can do democratic defense
Right.
at the elite pushback level, and maybe even at the civil disobedience level with some, committed liberal constitutional Democrats out there, speaking the language of the rule of law and electoral fairness and things like that.
Yeah.
Once you get to civil resistance, you really need to have much more mass mobilization.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing is not in the defense of elections or the separation of powers or a proper federalist structure or all these kinds of stuff from civics class.
Right.
That doesn't mobilize people. And so I guess I'm just wondering what the sort of transition, I mean, in some ways the typology is very nice, but
Right.
but the mass movement thing shifts strategically quite a bit from
Yeah.
the different ones. Maybe withdraw on your fourth category of the uncivil
Yeah.
disobedience where you no longer need that. But if you're gonna run any of the, sort of mass politics strategies, you gotta do it on a different basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. As we know, I mean, the only people in the country who thought Harris's pitch along those lines was effective, probably the people sitting here and some other, right? I mean, it did not work, and that was extremely. That's right. No, you're right. Okay, sorry. No, I'm joking, but yeah, but it didn't have quite the. I thought with that argument, it was the deal. It's over, and that wasn't the case. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so this also speaks to this, and I think we agree about this. How. We inevitably, talking about these questions, even as political theorists or philosophers, we're going to be making these kinds of contextual, contingent judgment and evaluation. So I think one thing to say to that would be, a mass civil resistance movement, or let's say selective types of uncivil disobedience, some of which would also rely, not all of them, but some of them on numbers, right? I mean, a pro-democracy movement has to speak to concrete issues, obviously, and you have to figure out what that would mean, right? So just going out and saying, okay, democracy rah rah is not going to do it. So it has to be kind of brought down, if you will, to a kind of policy level. That's where political craftsmanship comes in, I think, right? To figure out how to do that, And I think in a way, I mean, I'm now going to. I think Harris tried to do that last year, right? So yes, you had the argument about democracy, and then I think the strategy in part was, okay, but we're going to combine that with other things which are connected to the battle for democracy, that are more down-to-earth things that people can kind of. So that has to happen clearly. I mean, you're right about that, but I don't think this is an argument that says, the only political rhetoric that people who are pursuing any of these strategies. Has to be just about democracy or the rule of law. No, I mean, clearly not. That would be naive. I can see why you would think that, and it's true. I haven't thought enough about that, so you're absolutely right to put that out there. But I just think as we're talking about this, that can't be the, So you need a kind of a politics that reaches people that also somehow speaks to these fundamental threats to democracy and the rule of law. Not an easy thing to do, obviously.
Thank you. I'll remind people to introduce themselves when they speak.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a student at the college in Professor Gordon's fascism class this semester.
So I bet his PowerPoint's better. You don't use it. You're laughing. Is that?
Decline to
Sorry.
But I kind of wanted to return to the first question and put it perhaps a little bit more strongly,
Yeah.
which is, when we're thinking about how to resist something that seems sort of unclear how authoritarian it is at this particular
Yeah.
moment. And I think there's, a sense that if you think something is actually heading that way, perhaps the right response is a sort of more dramatic action. But then this poses this problem that, I'm sorry for writing your name, that you raised, which is it, creates a window for a government to say, everything's going to hell and we need to cancel elections or, really crack down on protests. And so I think there's a kind of sensible line of reasoning that goes, we should be pretty prudent to avoid giving a state that kind of excuse.
Yeah.
And yet, of course, the flip side of that argument is, well, if you think a state is going to use that kind of excuse, that that means you're somewhere pretty scary. And for that precise reason, perhaps more intense resistance is justified. And so I guess I wonder. I mean, and I know you probably can't really answer this question, but like how we should be thinking about like prudence or that kind of political
Yeah.
calibration, which seems like it points in both directions quite strongly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I like the way you put that. Although, I'd be curious what you have in mind with more intense, or what are you thinking about?
Like more violent.
Okay,
or,
I'm just trying to understand, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you're right. This is what I've been trying to say. So, I mean, there are these very different questions. There's a question, I would say, of justifiability. That's kind of the political theorist question, right? There are questions of prudence, political judgment. There's also, I would say, and this can speak to the question of prudence, the social scientific evidence. So it sounds like I'm with you, if I understood you correctly. I mean, I do think these more cautious approaches. I mean, this is, I think, what makes most sense right now. However,
They may not do it, and then you're really going to have to think about the other things, and we're going to have to pay attention to the social science in a nuanced way. I mean, that's something we as whoever, I don't know who's here, those of us who are scholars, it's our job to say, well, we've learned this about when sabotage happens. This is what often we see. So maybe it'll be different this time, right? So that's part of our role as scholars. And then there's always very complicated questions of prudence and situation. I spent a lot of time reading the project, what is it called, Project 25? Some of the stuff in there in terms of, I think President Trump and his people are waiting for a protest to get violent, which they understand. I mean, basically, you look at the president, excuse me, I'm now exaggerating clearly, as I did a moment ago, but for them, that means you look at the president in a funny way. They have a very broad definition of that. And they're waiting, I think they're talking about the Insurrection Act. I mean, this crazy stuff. And based on what we've seen the last 2 months, I don't think there's any reason to preclude that happening. So, what does that mean? Well, you're right. It means that if that's what we have to worry about, that's a very scary place to be. I never would have thought in my lifetime I'd have to be there, But I think we also have to be aware of that, So what that's going to mean, I think, is going to, so my instinct is to say, all right, so we're going to have to try. I mean, so what that might mean, this is potentially interesting, and I think this does speak to at least some of the things I was talking about, nonviolent legal protests, maybe civil disobedience. If you see the kind of crazy crackdown, which I think they want to do, I do think that could be politically counterproductive. Maybe I'm naive about that. But that's where you'd have to start, versus, let's say, I don't know, sabotage or I don't know, whatever the more militant thing would be. But you're right, there's many different, I'm sorry, I'm sort of repeating what I was saying, because I don't, it's difficult, yeah. Someone over here.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed this very much. I just had a question about the thing I sort of suffer from the most is high levels of uncertainty. You just referred to the social science,
Yeah.
giving us some answers. And I guess high levels of uncertainty about where we are in the process.
yeah.
High levels of uncertainty about, even if we could figure out where we are in the process, like how bad things are. High levels of uncertainty about what the proper response is.
Right. I think all those things.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
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 And then high levels, and this is maybe uncertainty, disagreements among what you've described, people about what's the right response. So even if people are sure what they think is the right response, inevitably there's going to be, in a democratic society, there's going to be, we're sitting right next to each other. We have different ideas of what's the appropriate thing, right? So there's going to be different people are going to have to, so I'm just wondering how, as a normative theorist, I don't know if you have an answer to this question, how do you incorporate uncertainty into all of this? Is there a way, how do we, what do we do with that uncertainty? Is there any way that could be?
You know, it's a really, I have to think about that. So again, maybe my answer is just too much like a comic strip or something. So I'm thinking of Rawls, and what Rawls says, whatever the flaws of this very famous discussion, what I like about it is it's actually quite modest in some ways, where he says, okay, if you understand a basically liberal order, that means something in terms of what is justifiable, right? However, whether or not this is contingent, whether or not this is prudential, going to be effective, that's going to depend on all sorts of things where I, as a theorist, I don't have any special expertise there, I mean, it's going to depend on political culture, history, all kinds of things. So I actually think, the theorist can kind of lay out, can do that kind of thing, like given the kind of regime that we have or we're losing, here's what makes sense, right? I also think, and maybe I was trying to do this and didn't succeed, I think the theorist's job, I did try to do this, is to say, well, here are these different approaches. Let's kind of look at them, and do this kind of conceptual thing. But you're right. I mean, there's so many ways in which uncertainty is, even part of that story. Like, okay, so you say within a liberal democratic order, civil disobedience. He also says, by the way, it's conscientious objection, not just civil disobedience. They're kind of paired together, right? I didn't talk about that. But even there, he's conceding that there are going to be judgments that we have to make about whether or not we have that kind of order or how much of that we have. So you're right. I mean, so, the role of the theorist, sorry to disappoint you, I think is actually in many ways very minimal. And this is why, and I'm not just saying this because you asked the question. I mean, I think there really has to be this conversation between the theorist and the empirical people. So I think the theorist can kind of bring maybe some conceptual clarity. As I was saying, I think the Chenoweth stuff, I do think there's a very interesting normative argument that she's making that isn't always kind of pulled out. And I think that's interesting and useful, So that's kind of our role, but we also have to recognize its limitations, But you're right, there are uncertainties in so many different levels of this. And, but that's also, in a way, that's democracy. Sorry, I mean, it'd just be really, if you understand democratic politics, and I can hold forth about democratic politics as a theorist, right? That makes sense in a way, because there are, we as democratic citizens ultimately are going to have to decide what we want to do with this stuff. And yeah, the experts can help us a little bit, but they're not going to answer all of our questions, So.
Let's see, sir, forgive me, I don't need any.
Okay, this person's had our hand up right next to you.
Stephen Sawyer, I'm a visiting scholar here for the year. I'm sort of going back to the second question about democracy, and it's really both from an empirical level, but also perhaps as a normative theorist, the construction of the object around which these four modes of resistance take place. And it does seem to me, just sort of here putting on more of an academic hat, when I listen to the talk, I'm not exactly sure what we're actually talking about.
Yeah.
That is, we sort of, I think all of us in this room know what you're talking about,
Right.
but it remains at the level of almost entirely unsaid. What this object is, what is this thing
Okay.
outside of democracy at some broad level
Yeah.
that we are mobilizing for? And it does seem to me that in the empirical literature, there is quite a bit of work on how you construct that object.
Yeah. So, just so I understand, object being what? Sorry.
What is it that would drive us into these four different,
Oh, okay. All right, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
what are we,
Yeah.
right? So in the case of Black Lives Matter, it was very clear, and then there was sort of an obvious instant that, or in the case of the Arab Spring, or in the case of many of the movements in Europe in recent years, there's been an obvious sort of something, right? And so I guess it goes back to this question of, but democracy is just a hard thing to construct as the object around which people are mobilizing.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the empirical literature might be able to help both in terms of sort of something,
Yeah.
waiting for something that might set it off, the kinds of discourses that have to take place in
Yeah.
order to construct an object that would mobilize people, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with that.
I mean, just to think about the nonviolent civil resistance literature, right? Which is about pushing back or getting rid of an autocratic state. But that literature does pay attention to, again, all the different ways in which that's kind of happening on the ground. You know, I mean, Gene Sharp certainly did, right? He didn't think, I mean, this was Chris's question that you were building on, right? I mean, you go and read Gene Sharp, it's a fascinating, I mean, I had never read it, and, you know, it's a funny thing. He just goes through all of these different tactics and how they're nonviolent, and here's historical cases and so on. I mean, they're very concrete things, right? You know, there are food riots or whatever. But, you know, nonetheless, I would say that if for us, the task is going to be politically, as democratic citizens, to make the sorts of connections between those. Like right now, I mean, I'm just guessing. I'm not an economist, but I don't think the tariffs are going to go very well. How's that for a, you know, I took a college economics course. I think I learned it. I just, you know, so I think it's now a political task, you know, for people to say, oh, it's not just Elon Musk. You know, by the way, I suspect Trump will push him aside. Trump that way is clever. I mean, maybe he's read his famous example, Machiavelli. You have these guys, right, do the dirty work, and then you know. So that, I mean, we have to connect this to somehow issues in a way that makes sense to people. Connect this to the struggle for democracy. You know, and that's putting it that way maybe also makes it sound pedagogical in a way I don't, because as we know, you know. In these mass movements, so let me put it this way, a lot of social movements about very concrete issues, of course they can be part of the struggle for democracy without anybody even necessarily saying that in the movements, right? I mean, even Black Lives Matter, there weren't people out in the streets talking about, you know, Trump is backsliding. No, right? No, of course not. But that was clearly looking back a way in which there was kind of a mobilization, right? So, I mean, that's, you're right, the empirical literature speaks to that, and maybe I think, and Chris is right as well, I mean, so a different version of this would have to, I think, offer a more nuanced account of that. I made this sound like, okay, here are these different people all pushing back, rah-rah for democracy. I mean, that clearly is too simple politically, right? So I think that's a good point, yeah.
So let's see, I think you were next.
Hi, Elena Kempf, MIT. So my question builds on the questions about the difficulty of building a movement around rule of law, and also the question about the uncertainty and the difficulty of seeing the present clearly.
Right.
And that is, you know, I really, really appreciated your talk on the different forms of resistance, and I'm wondering, because I'm not an expert in this literature, what the empirical social science literature and theoretical literature has to say about explanations for absence of resistance in the face of democratic backsliding.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, I think if you dig into these different genres, there will be different answers to that. I'll just say that's a big question, right? I mean, the thing I was trying to get at, which this is just me trying to make sense. Excuse me, I don't want to turn this into a therapy session, right? You don't want it to be. You don't even know me, right? But you know, there is this sense, I mean, I'm noticing this, I'll just say this. I was on leave when Trump was elected the first time, came back from Germany, and just by chance, I'm teaching the same classes now that I taught then. And then people were really, I mean, even in Indiana, right? So the students at my university, I was kind of center left, center right. I mean, they were, I wouldn't say mobilized, but wow, they wanted to talk about stuff. And I'm hearing this from colleagues. Right now, people, you know, I'm not picking up on that. You know, there's something going on, right? And there's all kinds of explanations one can have. So I'm the one, you know, on this issue, I'm teaching the classics again. So I'm talking about the rule of law. No, I was doing Kant's Perpetual Peace this week. And talk about liberal internationalism. By the way, have you noticed liberal internationalism is going bye-bye? You know, and they kind of write this, and I'm sorry, I mean, there are students here. But it's you know, so there's something going on, which I'm actually very
I'm scared by, and I think it's not just the students. I don't want to pick on them, There's a sense of, so apparently there's some evidence, Chenoweth thinks there are many protests. I was in Chicago. I went just by chance with my partner, my wife. We were there for there was a women's march, and, we're kind of taking a break. We went to the theater. I got this on my phone and said, look, we have to do this. And we went, there were like 100 people there in Chicago. It really depressed me, I mean, 8 years ago, those were Indianapolis, there were 50,000, right? So, okay, so there's something going on, so I do think there's some real issues in terms of not just problems of mobilizing people around democracy or the rule of law, but just sustaining mass movements over a long period of time, And I'm not sure if, maybe I just don't know about it. There are people here more expert on this than I am. I don't know if there's really literature that speaks to that very much. I don't know if, maybe there is. I just haven't really come across. In other words, there are people talking about when the movements die out and when they don't work, but so what I've come across reading about this are many anecdotal comments about, and that's basically what I'm doing, maybe, exhaustion. At some point, if you talk to people in Hungary, they'll say, oh yeah, we did all those things too. I have a colleague in Hungary who said, this is what's going to be scaring. We did, first time around with Orban, what you guys did in 2017, and then, so this may happen. And I said, oh, no, we're different in this country. And, no, so, I'm sorry, I'm holding forth here, but I think this is a serious, my sense is this might be a serious lacuna in the scholarship, or it's just a serious lacuna in my understanding of the scholarship. But it's a serious issue, which we have to think about in a lot of different ways.
Please.
Just kind of.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Gabriel. I'm a member of the public. I just building on this question of why the absence of resistance or seeming absence of resistance. I am wondering about how the literature talks about how elites and civil society in general interact with each other, because for me, what I'm seeing in my circles is like everybody really mad at elites for not stepping up and for being cowards and not doing anything. And then the elites, well, some are and some aren't, that's vast overgeneralization, but then people in elite institutions are sort of like, well, we have to wait until there's this groundswell from civil society before we can act. Not judges, not, So I guess I'm just wondering, is the problem that we don't already have these pre-existing networks of solidarity between these different levels, and we have to build those, and that takes time, and time is what we don't have, or?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I'm not sure about that. But
Well, what I was trying to say is the elite pushback theory, as I called it. When you go and you pick this stuff up, it's really, the language it uses is about elites doing the right thing. And all I wanted to say is it's really a story about what you're talking about, right? Elites and civil society. And if you read it carefully, this is, I think, being acknowledged, and then not really worked out ultimately, which is okay because people do different things. So what I think you're speaking to is the fact that does fit certainly what that literature says. That's a very complicated thing, and it doesn't always work, So elites may not stand up for the guardrails, or they may stand up for them at the wrong time or the wrong ones, and there's a disconnect with civil society organizations. I think in fairness, this may disappoint you. I go back and forth with. I think like many people, I've shared your frustration. So part of me initially said, this is outrageous, because during the electoral campaign, the Democrats were calling Trump a fascist, right? And they should have been ready. And they don't seem to have really been ready for this, right? So that's one take. The other take is they're scrambling like everybody else. It is happening very, very rapidly, and so yes, Project 25, that is the playbook. They're doing the stuff they were talking about. I think some of the stuff they've been doing, the Elon Musk stuff, I wouldn't say that's a total surprise, but I think a lot of people, I've been surprised by by that, I'll just say, even though I've tried to follow this. So, in fairness to elites, they're also trying to figure things out. And, you know, the gist of my talk would be, that's why we need more elites. So we're going to have to figure out, people from the public, like you and me, we're both part of the public, you know, what we should be doing. And, you know, that's going to have to be coordinated ultimately with elites. And, right, you know. So, yeah, so what do you think we should do? How's that? I was hoping we'd have a conversation. I'm hoping, you know, you see, I don't have a lot of.
Chuck Schumer for one thing.
Okay, well, all right, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, honestly, like, I'm scrambling. I joined a
right,
resistance course.
Yeah.
I joined the legal observers. I don't know what
Yeah.
to do, and I don't see, like, anyone kind of articulating a vision that makes
Well-
sense and everybody can get
Yeah.
behind either.
Well, I think there's a bigger issue here in this country, you know, so, I mean, I've been teaching democratic theory for a long time, and I think, you know, there's a lot of evidence, the kinds of organizations and institutions that are essential to a thriving society, we've allowed them, they've eroded in the United States. You know, so people say, why aren't there demonstrations? And I want to say, well, if you go and you look at some of those big demonstrations, historically, you know who organized them? The United Automobile Workers, right? Labor unions, right? I mean, in this country. And they're right now in a very awkward situation, I think. I mean, I think the leadership, with the exception of the Teamsters, you know, they are thinking the right things, but their members are not. You know, this is really the Trump's appeal. And so they can't get out there, you know. So that's different, you know. So, I mean, there are what we're seeing with the media, that's very alarming, right? I mean, right? So the kinds of, again, so what you're talking about, mass mobilization, a mobilized civil society working with elites in the right way, that doesn't just come out of thin air, you know? I mean, it's partly grassroots, but it's not just grassroots. I mean, you need, right? I mean, and a lot of these organizations have, so that would be another lecture. I think this really, so where I'm worried is I think we're seeing the consequences of long-standing deterioration to American democracy. I don't even think people, I mean, how's this for a comment? Again, maybe it's anecdotal. So my campus, I'm not noticing, it turns out I have a bunch of the college Democrats in my class, and they're now coming to me. And, you know, talking, because I'll make these comments in class. I'm pretty cautious, I think, probably not, but I try to be, right? And I'm talking to them, and I don't think they actually, you know, sort of basic political skills. You know, so the guy they don't no longer call it communication director, they call it marketing director, which bothered me, right? I was like, I know, right? But okay, whatever, who cares? You know, so I was like, well, I haven't seen too much publicity about this, and, you know, have you reached out to, I'll spare you the details, another campus in Indiana, Earlham College, it's a Quaker college, very liberal. There aren't networks that are there, you know. He said to me, oh yeah, we're putting this stuff on Instagram, you know. I mean, maybe that's the way people talk, but that's an issue. I don't think people know. So if you read, I teach Hannah Arendt, and politics is political action. It's action in concert. It's not just hard work, but it's very complicated in lots of ways. And in American democracy, we don't do a lot of this, in my view. I just say this, I don't think we do a lot of it. You know, it's not Tocqueville's America anymore. You know, and we've had other institutions kind of fill the role historically. I'm not one of these people who romanticizes antebellum America, right? But, you know, labor unions, for example, were institutions at certain times, certain places where there was action in concert about concrete issues. They weren't talking about, you know, the UAW, even though the leadership was very social democratic at one point, they weren't talking about social democracy. They were talking about wages, you know, and I think those institutions are, you know, they're not really what they had been. So that's something that should disturb us, because grassroots, spontaneous action's only going to get you so far. Sorry, right? I mean, you know, it's not going to just happen. So yeah, I think you're raising fundamental questions.
Bill, there are four
Yeah,
more
and I'm talking
questions.
too much.
You're not talking too much. This is fascinating, but I'm also aware that it's
Yeah.
just about 6 o'clock. So
Yeah.
if you don't mind, I'm going to collect the
Please do
last
that.
4 questions. And then we'll try to stop by at the very latest 6:10 or something like that. So,
Okay,
please.
my name is Manfred Wiegand.
I know, yeah.
I'm not part of the academia, but I would say I have two hats. One is because I'm I was following American politics, and particularly from a legal side because I'm a lawyer, and writing about this for a German audience, but also Bill, a little bit of a student of Weimar history.
Yeah.
And on the other side, I'm also locally thinking, what can we do? And I try to start some local activism. So I see this from a theoretic, but also from a practical viewpoint. And there's so much to be touched. I commend you how nicely you have presented this very complex subject. But what I heard a couple times or 3 times saying you is, we are not there yet.
Yeah.
So that is the question. It
Right,
seems
yeah.
to be a thing of proportionality. What can we do on resistance? It has to be kind of proportionate to where we are.
Right.
But the problem is that it's difficult when you see how this was done. For me, it's a coup. And it was really very similar to what happened in 1933 in Germany. Yeah? It's what you call Gleichschaltung. Yeah? And you have it in all kinds of spheres. You have it in a more civil level, like targeting the law firms who can bring lawsuits. Yeah? You have the party, the Republican Party was in the pocket anyways, yeah? But they don't dare to say anything. Then you put in the security forces, FBI and the Justice Ministry, people who have only one loyalty and who don't care for the law. Yeah? And then you go to other people, you go to the universities. Yeah? They succumb too. Yeah? So basically, and the military has also been cut of any critical forces, or potentially the DEI term is basically done to get anybody who could be eventually somehow critical, so that they are targeted. So we are already in a state where there is nothing on the state level, or partly also on the civil society level, who can be really produce resistance. Yeah? So we are very far. And then the question is, it came up here, do we have to wait to defend democracy until we have a mass movement where 70% of the people are against it?
Of course not. No.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah,
it's
no,
never
yeah.
happened in history. Yeah?
Yeah, no, I agree.
There must
I
be
agree with that, obviously,
some groups and some elites also who lead the way and who start something. And I think we cannot only argue with how the Democrats do it. Oh, tariffs are bad and the egg prices are still not good. Yeah, we also have to make people clear that this is the rule of law. Is maybe they're more interested in the rule of law than in democracy. Yeah, and when you see things like that ICE goes out there like Gestapo and just fish people for having expressed the normal thing. So the question is, where is the point where you say that now it's enough, or is it not? Do you have to anticipate also?
Okay.
Yeah?
This was
Sorry.
one question. I'm going to collect 4 here.
That's a
Yeah,
good-
but it's a very good
Great
statement
one.
that Weimar is looming over all. Sir, please. Yeah, didn't you have your hand up yet?
Well, I had a question. You mentioned Elon Musk, and I was thinking of this whole Tesla takedown as a kind of use case for your framework.
Yeah.
You know, on the one hand, there has been some vandalism,
Yeah.
but more, it's really almost like a boycott or an effort to stimulate a boycott to do economic damage to its interests, and it's actually not just here. It's becoming a kind of global movement. So, you know, I don't know that you mentioned boycotts, so I thought I would just, it's an interesting use case for you.
There were 2 more, and then I saw one more hand go up. So I'll let that person speak.
Jotting these down very quickly.
Please. And
My name is Norman Doust. I'm a 40-year-plus citizen here in Cambridge.
Hi.
I think we've been talking about your nice 4-level hierarchical modes of resistance. As if we're in one mode and then we progress to the next one. When I'm thinking that it depends on your perspective. For example, if I am just a citizen in Cambridge who's so I'm going to experience some financial. So if I were a vaccine researcher across the river here, they're going to experience the loss of a job, and they're going to recognize that there are going to be millions of people in Africa who are going to be.
Yeah.
If I were a citizen, undocumented immigrant in Chelsea, Massachusetts, they're experiencing the possible
Deportation.
Yep.
just takeaway, in
Right.
the middle of the day, and some of their others, and they're like 200 people. So I wonder if the level at which they're prepared to take action depends upon their context.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, two more questions over here. And they'll just try to
These
keep them
are
all.
great questions, and I'm not gonna.
Yeah.
I'm Rich Weiner. I'm an affiliate here at CES, and I'm an emeritus dean from Rhode Island. The title of your talk leads us in a different direction than the nature of your talk,
Yeah.
all right?
had to
Because
the title.
authoritarian populism is a term that was used by Stuart Hall, and when he wrote about policing the crisis. And if one thinks, okay, I'm almost 80 now, but having lived in Britain during the miners' strike, I could see each of these stages in the miners' strike. First, before there was a strike, there was Barbara Castle and Harold Wilson, et cetera, and the TUC. All right, and then there was the civil disobedience. Then it was uncivil disobedience.
Yeah.
But then people started dropping bricks on people's cars, and they tried to assassinate Margaret Thatcher. Can do the same thing with Irish republicanism. In each case, there was a perception of that they were dealing with autocracy.
Yeah.
So I think that because you're, and I'm very, how do you say it? I'm very much like yourself, someone who's concerned with empirically grounded political theory. In a sense, I think the issue of authoritarian populism that Stuart Hall brought up, which he never gave Seymour Martin Lipset any credit for, because it was authoritarian working class. And we remember Lipset did it because of McCarthyism, all right? And he was writing that at a time where there was the perception of a kind of autocracy that could develop within the Republican Party.
Okay, and one last question, and then Bill, you can kind of sum up.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor Schman, a very fascinating talk. I am an academic based in Germany and I'm affiliated here at the Weller Center. I'd like just to hear your thoughts a little bit on the example of Eastern Europe in the late 80s and 90s. It seems to me like if we think historically, lots of the questions you raised here, the uncertainty, were the questions that Adam Michnik had in mind, Havel also, Solidarność leaders, and certainly some of us who protested against Milosevic in the 90s, we didn't see an end in sight.
Right.
We were all kind of, had some principles, an idea, we were operating with this idea of power of powerlessness and powerlessness of powerful. But it seems to me two factors were always very important and what mobilized people at every stage. The notion of freedom, as something that we share, and a notion of pride. So everyone had to tap into this national repertoires of what made that nation great, however mythical that must be.
Yeah.
I was wondering, since you seem to be familiar with German context in Europe, is there something where you could reflect and see something that one can take from that? Because there are certainly, in my opinion, continuities. Thank you.
Okay, very good.
These are all great, big questions, right? So, I mean, I teach some of the authors in that period, love teaching Havel, for example, to undergraduates, and they seem to enjoy it still. I do think, I'll just say, I think our situation, so this is a way in which my talk was also inadequate, so you can add to your criticisms, right? Because I'm talking about the battle against authoritarianism in this kind of generic way at times, and that's not quite the same thing as talking about backsliding, right? So trying to establish out of Soviet-style communist regimes, liberal democracies, I think that's very different from what we're facing today, you know, where you have, where we're losing something. So I think the situation's a little different, which doesn't mean, you know, that there aren't some lessons that one could draw, you know. I mean, certainly, I'd like to think that there are aspects of American national culture that those of us who want to resist this can, call on effectively. I believe that, actually. Read the Declaration of Independence, read the stuff there about tyrannical kings, right? So that's certainly similar. But I do think it's a different situation. Yeah. So populism. So this is one reason why I wanted to avoid this. As I'm sure you know, there are a lot of people now using this term to describe people like Trump or Viktor Orban. They're using it in a very different way from Stuart Hall. So I'll just say, there are ways in which, on this more recent definition of populism, which maybe is problematic in some ways. Someone like Trump is a populist. There's an authentic we the people. That's his base of support, the real Americans versus the rest of us, right? There's a kind of friend-foe dynamic there. But I think the populist debate going on now is a little different and disconnected from that older debate, which is very interesting in many ways, and maybe we can talk more about that. But this is one reason why I didn't want to talk too much about populism. I think we're better off talking about
Authoritarian populism.
Yeah, no, that's right. No, and but I think why I decided to stick to democratic backsliding, which still raises all sorts of questions in terms of is what some people are now calling populism essential to that or not? But that's another question. Yeah, the question here about level of action and different, if I understood, different experiences, different impacts. I mean, wow. So that is clearly of political significance, right? But this is another way in which, I'm just stating the obvious, political action's action in concert. It's not just me saying, I'm a college professor. We no longer have tenure, by the way, in Indiana. We have this extremely right-wing government. I was impacted. I mean, there has to be some way in which these individual experiences, and you're right, they're very different experiences. One person losing the job, another person fearful of getting rounded up and sent to Louisiana, or me just worried about a repressive state government that doesn't take academic freedom. So politics is about trying to coordinate those things, right? And finding some sort of common language to do so. I don't have much more to say about that. And I wish I had some answers to that, but I think that's what we have to do. I mean, I think there are ways in which the way you depict it maybe makes it seem more difficult than it is. I mean, I think if you were to talk to your different examples, they would all say, we know exactly who's doing this to us, right? I mean, maybe. I mean, I'm hoping, or at least it would be a political task to be able to convince them that, there is a problem here, right? That it's a general problem. But you're right. So boycotts and Tesla, yeah. I mean, well, I did talk about, so the nonviolent civil resistance literature includes boycotts as an example. And uncivil disobedience is also about sabotage. We're also seeing sabotage, which, as I'm sure you've heard, is now going to be treated as an act of terrorism, which maybe seemed like it came out of thin air to you, but after finishing this project on protest politics, I was less shocked because basically since 9/11, a lot of the anti-terrorism measures that we came up with in response to 9/11 have been recalibrated. So we have all kinds of eco-terrorist measures, animal rights activists who destroy property. They can be treated, but nothing to do with any recognizable academic or common sense understanding of terrorism, So, I do think the Tesla protests are interesting because you are seeing very different types of things. It's things that are moderate, like I'm just not going to buy that. And then, sabotage to the dealership. And that's, again, something where your answer to that question, I think, is going to depend on the question of, where we're at. So there's it, right? And what's kind of the tipping point, or when are things getting really bad or something? So, that's going to have to be part of the conversation, clearly. So, all I want to say is I do think these different paradigms do kind of have a way of thinking about that, if you want to dig into that a little bit. Yeah, so Manfred, I appreciate your bluntness, and I think we agree about this in lots of ways. So here's all I wanted to say is, number one, what you're doing and what I'm trying to do has to happen. There has to be a conversation. I know this is trivial, but I don't think I can say more as a political theorist, right, about where we're at. I think that's a conversation, again, all kinds of complicated judgments, evaluations. that will go into that. And there are going to be disagreements about that in a pluralistic society. Now, in that spirit, I'm going to push back a little bit. I mean, I don't think this is, I'm shocked by what's happening. I'm outraged. It's not a coup in the sense of a military coup, you know? So far, I mean, is this naive? I mean, my fear, and then I think, you know, your concerns become very, very pertinent. You know, if we're at the stage where the courts really start pushing back and we have open refusal, you know, to ignore those decisions. Maybe I'm missing this, but I think right now we're in a kind of gray zone there. I mean, there's fear that that would happen. There are certainly people around Trump who are saying to him, you know, you don't have to follow these court decisions pushing back, you know. In my view, that would be indeed, I mean, that's a significant step that we may see very soon, but I don't think we've seen that yet, towards an authoritarian state, you know, where judicial supremacy just goes out the window, you know. And I'll just tell you, I mean, I spent some time, there are ideologues who are now in the administration. You know, it's some of this stuff is astounding, and it's so astounding, well, I'll get very quickly. So there are people who are now originalists who are giving him legal advice. Okay, you know that. Some of these originalists say, and this is a half-truth, oh, during the constitutional founding, you know, judicial supremacy, a powerful Supreme Court was not part of that story. And that's right. I mean, you know, this is very ambivalent. You know, so when you teach Hamilton or read Hamilton, one will read the Federalist Papers as moving in the direction, but no, there wasn't. It's not Marbury v. Madison. That's the case, right? And some of these originalists are now saying, well, you know, if you have an original understanding of the Constitution, you know, the president doesn't really have to follow these court rulings. And there'll be references to what Jefferson was playing with doing, which I think is Marbury v. Madison, which became academic because of Chief Justice Marshall kind of found a way to keep Jefferson from doing the dirty thing and ignoring the Supreme Court. So, I mean, if, you know, there are people pushing for this, and we may see this, and I do think then, indeed, you know, but it's still, we're not, I mean, you know, it's not, I mean, we're here, I mean, this is trivial again. We're here talking, you know, we're facing pressures. I think this is more like what we saw in Viktor Orban's Hungary. It's not 1933 in Germany, and it's also not Viktor Orban now, it's earlier in the process. And I don't think that's being Pollyannish, I just don't. I think we have to be hard-headed about this, but I also, I mean, you know, Monfort and I have known each other a while, and you're very involved with local, you're out there doing stuff which, you know, wasn't really possible anymore, let's say. Really? And I don't know, you know, in 1933. Trying to organize people and so on. So, but you're right, this is a question, like exactly, you know, where are we? And I'm not just, yeah, I mean, and we're gonna have different assessments of that. Yeah, let me stop, let me end there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a
Thank
very
you.
rich.
Thank you.